Welcome tonight to the letter to the Romans, our class on Paul's gospel message. Tonight is lesson 1. And tonight what we're going to be doing is reviewing the background of the letter. And we're going to be reviewing a little bit about who Paul is. And so tonight is really just easing into the letter and getting a sense of the context of what's going on. And so I'm excited about that tonight because we get to learn a little bit about really who the author is and maybe a little bit of a sense of why he's writing before we get into what he's writing. All right, so let's go to the next slide and let's review a little bit about the class. Last week when we were here in the introduction, we reviewed that there are 8 lessons that we have in front of us. Tonight is lesson 1, and that lesson is going to be a review of the concept that this whole letter is about the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm going to talk about that tonight and why that's evident in Paul's writing and style. And then we're going to look at the 6 arguments we talked about last week in the introduction. And that's the righteousness of God, the unrighteousness of man, the justification by faith, the results of righteousness, what happens if you reject God's righteousness, and then finally what it looks like to live in God's righteousness. And that's really the course that we're going to be going through as we go through the letter of Romans, Paul's letter in the gospel message. And then actually we're going to spend the final lesson just reviewing what that message looks like. And in fact, I'd like you to start thinking about, as we shape and listen to Paul's arguments, about not only what he's saying, but how you would translate that, how you would relay that as part of the message. And sometimes it's not just translating or relaying that message, but also recognizing in a conversation with somebody that you're sharing the gospel message a component that they may not understand, a component that they may not be aware of, a component that they may simply be rejecting or refusing. For example, God's righteousness. Maybe something that's foreign to somebody. Maybe something that they're unaware of. And so as we go through these topics, it's not just something that you need to explain or debate. It's something that you need to see and recognize so that you can help guide and come along somebody. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. The 6 arguments, we talked about those last week in our introduction, and what we're going to really be looking at is how does that relate to me? So the righteousness of God, for example, what does that really mean? And what we want to try to get away from is the idea that we're speaking another language, some hidden Christian language, Christianese. What we want to speak is the truth, but we want to speak that in as practical a way as possible. In order to do that, we're going to really need to understand what that means. What does righteousness mean? And not in some kind of foreign way, some way that I go, well, yeah, I kind of get what that means, and I kind of think I know what that means. How would you explain that? How would you describe that? For me, it's simply perfection, God's perfection. When we talk about the unrighteousness of man, we talk about man's imperfection. And if you need an example of that, all you have to do is look at me. And we can actually look at each one of ourselves and say, okay, I get that, the imperfection of man. All right, but what does that mean to me in terms of the imperfection of man? Well, the problem with that is that's the bar that starts to get raised and the thing that people start to get weary of. Well, you're not perfect. Why are you telling me I'm not perfect? True. We're all not perfect. And in fact, one of the things that Paul's going to be explaining to us throughout these weeks is that that's the whole point. That's the whole problem. That's how God solves it in justification. He offers a solution. And he offers a solution in such a kind of perfect, marvelous way because it has to satisfy God's righteousness, his perfection. And yet it has to deal with our imperfection. Those two things are constantly in tension. So how does a holy, righteous God accept an unholy, imperfect creation that he's made? And do so in a way that it doesn't change his perfection. If he ignores it, it changes his perfection. Right? It changes how you view his justice. And so he offers a solution for us. He himself will become imperfection, our sin, in order that we would exchange or receive his perfection. And that exchange satisfies God's justice or righteousness. The result of that is that we get to be righteous in his eyes. We get to be perfect in his eyes, not because we're perfect, but because he's cloaked us. He's put a covering over us of perfection. That's pretty awesome, right? It's pretty awesome that we can be dirty and unclean, and yet he offers a clean robe, and that clean robe covers that dirtiness. In fact, what it really does is it cleanses us so that we can be in his presence. Because that's really what God desires, is to be in communion with us. So that's the results of righteousness. Now we can decide in these arguments that Paul will put forward, and he gives examples of that, and he principally uses Israel as that example, that he can offer his perfection, and we can just turn and walk away. Now, we could turn and walk away because we decide that we don't understand it. Yes, that's true. We cannot understand it. But what Paul's going to argue is that's not really the reason why we turn and walk away. We turn and walk away because we've exchanged God's righteousness, his perfection, for our own view of what perfection is. And when we make that exchange, we start to make up the rules about how we become perfect. And that's the trap that Israel got into. They made a whole set of rules that if I just do these things, I will satisfy God's righteousness. And Paul explains that that doesn't satisfy, it can't satisfy it. In fact, all those rules can do is point to our imperfection. And that pointing to our imperfection should bring us to the point of choice. And that's where God leaves us. He invites us into that choice. He says, come into that choice. Choose me. But he recognizes, and Paul's description of this is that we have a choice to reject or to receive what God is offering to us. And for those that have received God's righteousness, we then get the opportunity to live in it. And so what does that look like if you're clothed with a robe of perfection? Does that mean you're perfect? No, right? If it does, I'm in a lot of trouble. Because my life is far from perfect. And I can't get from the bed to the coffee machine in the morning without tripping up on that whole perfection thing. There's a thought, or there's an emotion that I'll have, or there's a moment where I'll fear something and forget that God is in charge. And that's before I get to the coffee machine. Just think about how much damage I do throughout the day. So it's not that the robe makes us perfect, but it does move us towards perfection. It moves us from imperfect to perfect. It moves us to become more like what God created us to be. And now that's exciting, because in the purpose for our lives, it's not just some kind of far away, we'll never really discover it concept. God created us so that we would be his representatives. Paul says the word ambassador, as though we were pleading on God's behalf so that others would know about him. That's what the robe does to us. It starts to change us. It starts to move us so that we're more and more like him, and that we can demonstrate to the world the reality and the existence of God. You know, one of the great topics today, it's raging and it's big, and it's at the heart of the question between faith and, I'd say, the natural world. One of the big questions today is, how can you prove God's existence? In this last section that we look at of the letter of Romans, Paul says, you are the proof that your lives, changed and transformed, demonstrates how real God is. All right? So that proof that we offer today is going to be the demonstration and the description and the declaration of the gospel message. How cool is that? We get to declare the truth of God, the good news. We talked last week in the introduction that this is really about truth, that there was a transforming truth in Paul's life that resulted as a result of the encounter with Jesus Christ. And it was so powerful to him that he had to run out and share it. You're going to see tonight just how far he ran. I mean, that truth so fueled him that it propelled him across the known world. And everywhere he went, there was either a riot or a revival. Those were the only two options. He didn't walk in and meekly say, you know what, I'll see what these guys say, and I'll kind of get to know them, and maybe once I get accepted, then he just walked right in. I want to tell you a truth. And the way he presented the truth was so powerful that those that had rejected that truth stoned him and beat him and chased him. And those that received it celebrated with joy. That's real power in this message. And that's the power of the message that he's teaching us through this letter. Okay, so those are the 6 arguments. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're taking 2 courses this session. One is Romans and the other is hermeneutics. And just a note on that, there are times when I'm going to switch back and forth just by practicing what we're learning in one or using Romans in another, okay? And so tonight we're going to be on topics in the hermeneutics course about observation and accessing information. And so what I'd like you to do tonight when we're in the Paul Romans class is to observe in the scriptures. So I have a lot of scriptures that we're going to be putting forward, and I want you to observe and start to learn the power of first putting aside kind of your bias that you might bring to a scripture and just notice what's there. So tonight we're going to learn about Paul from Paul, all right, in the letter. And the first thing we're going to learn is that he is the author, all right? So there are some letters, for example, Hebrews is one of them, that we have to kind of figure out who the author is. And in the example of the letter to the Hebrews, we don't really know who that is. Okay, we may have some strong opinions based on writing style, but we may have some extra biblical sources that point us to who the author is. In the case of the letter to the Romans, Paul declares himself to be the author, and you can see that in Romans 1:1. Paul says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God. And so the first thing we can observe in the first sentence of the letter is the declaration of the author by the author that I am the one writing this. Simple observation. Okay? We don't have to do anything more with that. We just have to know I have fairly high confidence that it's Paul writing this letter. Right? The next thing we're going to learn about him, we're going to have to go to other areas of Scripture to learn a little bit about Paul now. When we get to the hermeneutics course, we're going to see the power of understanding the context, knowing where you are in the Bible, so that you can access that information and then be able to put it together. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that for you. I've done some of the work for you here. And you'll see in Acts 22, verses 27 and 28, it says, so the tribune came and said to him, that's a Roman centurion or guard, he said, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Now he's just been arrested. Paul's just been arrested, and he's being treated in a way that Paul thinks is unfair for a Roman citizen, and that's come to the attention of the guard, and the guard's quite worried about that, because citizens had privileges, and they had rights, and those rights were not to be impugned. And so he comes and asks the question, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And Paul said, yes, and the tribune answered, I bought this citizenship. So there are 2 ways to become a citizen. One is I could buy my way into citizenship. I can buy my way out of slavery or out of being a non-citizen. I can buy my way into citizenship, buy my way into those rights and privileges. But Paul says, no, I'm a citizen by birth. So just another fact that we put aside with Paul. He's the author of the letter, and he's a Roman citizen, and he's a Roman citizen by birth. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep stacking those facts up. We're not going to add to them, and we're not going to try to interpret on them. We're just going to simply observe them. Fair? Okay. What else can we know about Paul? Well, in Philippians 3:5 it says, if anyone else thinks he has a reason for confidence in the flesh, now he's arguing against those who are boasting. He says, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to the righteousness under the law, blameless. So Paul is telling us a little bit about his background and particularly about his upbringing. We can see a number of things. That he was born as a Jew, circumcised under the tradition. So he's going back to the beginning of his life and saying, I have been a Hebrew of Hebrews from the start. I'm a Roman citizen, but I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. And I was trained as a Pharisee. And as far as I'm concerned, in practicing the law, I was blameless. Now, he comes to understand a different view of what that meant. But in terms of chasing the law, trying to follow the law, he would say, look, nobody else did that better than me. Okay, so that's a view of Paul from childhood all the way up through, and up to, in fact, his encounter with Christ. And he includes in there one other thing. He says, because of my zeal, because of my desire for God, I persecuted the church. So that energy and passion that he had, misdirected, ends up going against the church, going against God's direction, right? It's an interesting fact. We'll file that away too. We don't want to add to it or take away from it. We just want to observe it. So we've learned already, just in 3 scriptures, a couple things about Paul. The next one in Acts 22. Let's go to the next slide. So this was one of my favorites because often when we put this up, people will say, no, that's not right. So I actually just put the scripture in there instead of going back to the scripture. He was not just a Pharisee. He was the son of a Pharisee. So there's a strong Jewish tradition in his family. And not just a Jewish tradition, but a tradition of teaching and of being effectively one of the ruling bodies, being one of the legal scribes. And so he's following in the footsteps of his father. The thing I said before about just putting the scripture up there is when you say he's the son of a Pharisee, I've had people who have taught classes on Romans say, no, that's not true. He's not the son of a Pharisee. And it shows you the importance of observation. People who have taught the courses have failed to just plainly read the scripture. Okay? So there's no work that we had to do to go outside. I don't have to have a doctorate on Paul. I don't have to research early church history. Paul says plainly, I was the son of a Pharisee. Just the power of observation. Okay? So it gives us a little bit of a sense. Are you getting a feel for Paul's life as he's growing into his faith? He's growing into his faith from a very Jewish perspective. And so that would maybe tell us, as we look at observation and what we do with those facts, that would tell us a little bit about maybe his sense of understanding of the scriptures. If he were a Pharisee, he would be well versed in them. Okay, so that's going to give us a sense as we go through and we observe what he's talking about, if we see him quoting scriptures in Romans, and he does that in a fantastic way. He has a way of just putting a whole bunch of these Old Testament verses together and just putting them together to show meaning to them. It shows his skill, and now we know why he has that skill is because he's been trained. Okay? All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, a little bit that I want to talk about in terms of Paul's approach. He had a set pattern as he traveled, and his set pattern he describes in Acts 17, 1 through 3. Not he, Luke describes it, who's the author, but Luke was a travel partner of Paul's, so he's an eyewitness to this pattern, and he includes it in there for us to understand what Paul's MO is. How does he operate when he's traveling around? And so if you were an itinerant preacher now, if you were going and carrying the gospel around, what would be your standard operating procedure? How would you, for example, in Motel Church, enter into one of the Motel churches or begin a Motel church? How would you begin a ministry? What would be the starting point? Here was Paul's starting point. So when they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as was his custom, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ." So he goes into a city, he goes into the synagogue, and the first thing he does, and he does it for weeks at a time, is demonstrate to them, reasoned with them from the Scriptures, who Jesus was. Okay? So he introduces the gospel as he enters into a city. He proclaims it using the Scriptures. And he does that for a period of time. That's his MO. That's his standard operating procedure. That's how he starts a ministry in a town that he enters into. So why bring that up? Romans is different. Romans breaks that pattern. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We're going to get to that in a minute. But in order to get to that, I just want to come back to the thing that changed or transformed Paul, a little bit more on Paul before we get to the break in that pattern. Last week we talked about in the introduction the idea that there's a truth that's so compelling in our lives that we have to tell it. There's an experience that we have that when we experience it, we can't wait to tell somebody. And I said, don't just think about our encounter with Jesus Christ, but think about something. And I used the example of the birth of my children. And I said, when I had that experience for weeks on end, and even till this day, I can't stop talking about them. I love them dearly, and I can't help but want to tell you about them, because there's a truth in that to me. And if you need to see the truth, all I have to do is produce my children and say, look, right? Wasn't I right? Right? So Paul's truth is his encounter, and that encounter is the encounter he has with Jesus Christ. It says in Acts 9, after this encounter, Jesus is instructing him what to do with that encounter. And it says, but the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel." So he gives him a mission. Jesus calls him and directs him and sends him. Same pattern, by the way, he has for every single one of us. Now, the pattern doesn't change, but the destination does. The places that will be sent are all different. We think about it like the maps I'm about to show you that God sent Paul, and we go, oh, wait, time out. I can't do that. I've got a whole schedule of stuff over the next week. I can't be in Asia Minor next week. I can't go to Turkey and start spreading the gospel. Or we think about in terms of missionary trips where the first destination is some desolate place somewhere halfway around the world that we're going to be sent to go spread the gospel. And that may be true for some of you. For some of you tonight, God is already speaking on your heart and saying, I've got a place that I'm sending you, and you're my chosen vessel. But my experience is the majority of us, he's sending us into the communities that we live in. You know, a shift has occurred in the last less than 10 years. America used to be the place that sent missionaries out to the world. America is becoming the place that missionaries are being sent to. And the only reason why that would be is because we're not going into our own communities and demonstrating the light of the gospel. Doesn't have to be preaching it, but demonstrating it. And that demonstration results in a sharing. And so we are going to need to get comfortable with this verse, because the same pattern is going to apply in our lives. God's going to call us, and he's going to send us, and then we have to listen and be clear about the destination that he's sending us to. Okay? Where did he send Paul? Let's go to the next slide. So, Paul was on the road to Damascus when he meets or encounters Jesus Christ. That's a big, long road. From Jerusalem to Damascus is further than Southern California to Northern California. and there's no high-speed rail to get there. Certainly the freeways weren't as good either. And so that's a long trip where he's headed on, and God encounters him. And you can see in the process that he's under already before he encounters Christ, that he's traveling far distances under the zeal that he talked about in his persecuting the church. And God reverses that and says, okay, I'm going to use that. I'm just going to send you in a different direction with a different message. And so he has 3 primary missionary journeys. Now there's a 4th journey that's often talked about, and that journey is the journey to Rome as he's imprisoned. And there's a question about whether or not Paul was released from that prison while at Rome, and whether or not he did an additional missionary trip. And so the classical view is 4 missionary trips. I'm going to talk about the 3 because they're the 3 before in prison. And I just want you to get a sense of his standard operating procedure again. So let's go to the first slide. I want you to notice a couple things. This is missionary trip number 1. And missionary trip number 1, your homework assignment is to remember every city in the order that he's been to. Yeah? All right, let's skip that. Pronounce them. Now, what we really need to do is just notice that first Paul is sent out, and he's going to begin establishing churches. And there's really a concentric area that he's going to begin to start. He goes to the nearest areas first. He establishes churches there. Let's go to the next slide. He goes further out on his 2nd trip. He revisits the first churches. He doesn't just forget about them. He establishes a base. He shares the gospel message. He's using his standard operating procedure of sharing the gospel in the synagogues. Then he builds out leadership, and then he moves on and continues on that mission. One of the things we can infer from that is he was clear about what God had called him to do. He could have stayed in any one of these cities, been the head pastor, right? And he could have stayed for a long time, but he understood that that Jesus gave him that direct assignment. You're going to go, and you're going to be my minister to the Gentiles. And so the clarity of that mission is important. And as he revisits them and goes, it's on this 2nd journey that he is in Corinth that he's going to write a letter to Rome. All right, on the 3rd journey, we see he revisits it. He goes from Asia Minor. He touches Europe in the 2nd trip, and in the 3rd trip, he goes back to Asia Minor. He goes and further into Europe on the 3rd trip. There's no Southwest Airlines at this time. And when you read the record of his travel, he's shipwrecked, he's stoned, he's beaten, he's imprisoned several times. It's not just that the travel to and forth was hard. It's that when he got there, he presented the truth in such a way that he had this radical reception to it. Yes or no? Okay? But he didn't compromise on that. It didn't change the message. We're going to see that in this letter, that it doesn't change the message. He doesn't have a relationship like he has with these churches. The other epistles that he's writing to are always after he's been there. He's been to that church or he's been to that area. So he's known directly or he's known by reputation. And so he's usually following up to questions about his gospel presentation. But to the letter to the Romans, it's like hearing what it would be like in the synagogues when he walks in the first time. And you go, whoa, who is this? Remember, we talked a little bit about the righteousness of God and the unrighteousness of man. And if we were sitting in church and we heard, God's perfect and you're not, to start the message, without knowing who's presenting it to us, it would cause a little bit of uneasiness maybe. And so what we can see in that, though, is the uncompromising nature of him sharing that truth. He doesn't change it in order to be more well-liked. God's really nice, and he loves you only. Don't worry about the whole justice thing. Don't worry about the whole perfection thing. we're imperfect and God will accept us in that imperfection. No, that's not what he's saying. He's not smoothing over the message in order to be well received personally. He's presenting it as he's received it. That's our call. We receive what God has given to us, and we share it. And Jesus promised us. He said, look, they weren't really happy when I did that. They're not going to be really happy when you do that too. Just know that. Be prepared for that. Okay? All right, let's go to the next slide. Just put this in here to give a sense of if the letter is written in Corinth and it's sent to Rome, just getting the letter from Corinth to Rome wasn't a FedEx envelope. Didn't go overnight. It didn't get there next day. People had to travel quite a distance to deliver that letter. Right? So there's a sense of weight to that I think we miss today because of the convenience of travel and the convenience of communication that we have in our lives. That these letters were special. They carried a special weight and authority to them. I mean, if you want to go hop on a boat and spend the next month delivering a letter, you would get the sense of that, right? And for somebody to send you on a boat for a month with a letter, and a month would be a short time. That means they think it's important enough to deliver that message. Fair? Okay. All right, let's go to the next letter, the next slide. Okay, we're down to 2 more slides, and this is the heart of our background and introduction. In the introduction last week, we talked about, I tried to put a disclaimer on this section, and I said if you were to pick up a commentary on the book of Romans, people far more capable than I who've written volumes on this book will say that the first 8 chapters, usually the dividing point, is the first half of the letter, is the gospel message. And then there will be titles about the remaining 8 chapters, different topics, their view of what the remaining 8 chapters are. They will say that the main theme is the Gospels simply because it consumes so much of the letter. But I'd like you to look at your book right now, and if you look at the background section, there's a section in there in Lesson 1. Look down here as you go. That's the wrong book.
Page 9.
No, go next one. Go next one. There you go. Okay, so this is
Page 11.
on page 11, you're going to see a chart, and you're going to see a layout. And I tried to pull this into the slide, but I couldn't get the graphic to come in. So this is the word usage and distribution of how Paul uses the word gospel. And what you'll see in that distribution is that he uses it, I'm going to lean over here, he uses it 4 times in chapter 1, 1 time in chapter 2, 2 times in chapter 10, 1 time in chapter 11, 4 times again in chapter 15, and 1 time in chapter 16. There's actually a repeating pattern there of 412, 412. And what the point of that distribution is, he uses it at the beginning frequently, he uses it in the middle, and he uses it at the end. So when he's referring to the theme of the letter, he's not just referring to the theme of the letter, he's constantly referring back to it. Whatever topic he's on, he's coming back and saying, remember that gospel thing I introduced in the beginning? This is about that too. Remember that gospel message? Rejecting God's righteousness? This is about the gospel too. Remember about the whole idea of living in the righteousness of God? That's about the gospel too. He's constantly referring back to that. And so that distribution of how he uses the word tells us a little bit something about the main message of the word. And when you look at how word usages occur in Paul's letters, they become really important because when he repeats something often and where he repeats it points us to the point of what he's saying. When we get into the hermeneutics course, we're going to see that a good idea to look at is words that are repeated. Words that are repeated give us the absolute blinking neon sign. This is important. Pay attention. And so Paul, throughout the entire book of Romans, is just blinking that message. Gospel, gospel, gospel. In case you missed it, gospel, gospel, gospel. And he just keeps repeating that But he doesn't repeat it in one chapter. He lays it out evenly throughout the entire book. I think that's kind of cool, right? So that gives us a sense of the structure of the letter. In fact, he opens the letter with it. You can see that in verse 1, in chapter 1, verse 15. The opening of the letter states Paul's theme plainly. So much is in me, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. Now we're going to come back in a second to that theme. But he opens the letter with it, and then he closes the letter. He ends the letter in the same fashion as began. He says the second to last verse of the letter in chapter 16. So chapter 1 and chapter 16 open and close with his reference to the gospel. He says, now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel and to the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, kept secret since the world began, but now made manifest, and by the prophetic scriptures made known to all nations, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, for obedience to faith, to God alone, wise, be glory through Jesus Christ forever. Amen. So he says, according to that gospel, these things. In the beginning, he opens and says, I'm ready to preach this to you. In the end, he closes and says, according to all that I preach to you, these things. All right? So it sandwiches the entire message. Fair? Let's go to the theme, and we're going to close on this tonight, because this is going to start to lead us in to chapters 1 and 2 as we jump into the righteousness of God in lesson 2 next week. We want to first understand what's the primary purpose of Paul's letter. Now, we could spend a lot of time studying it. There's a lot of really important tricks that you can apply, or you can just read what he says. I prefer to just read it. He states it plainly in this letter. He says, in the opening of his letter, he says, so much is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. And Paul's going to declare 3 things about that gospel message that he's going to carry forward throughout the letter. The first is that it's promised beforehand through the prophets. So the gospel message isn't a new message. It's been there from the beginning. Are those that come before Christ's birth and death, are they not saved? Can they be saved? Did salvation only come at the time of the cross, forward?
I think they were saved based on what they read in the Old Testament.
Paul says, Paul says, this message was promised. And those that were before Christ, his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection, lived in the hope of that. They lived the hope of salvation, and that results in salvation. This is called the proto-evangelion, the gospel beforehand. That's the first thing he tells us about the theme. The second thing he tells us is that the gospel that he's going to preach to you is about God's Son. Okay? So the good news, the message of the truth, is specifically related to Jesus Christ. Why? Because as he explains down the road, there's a problem needs to be solved, he's the solution. Without the solution, we have no hope. Okay? So it can't be that there's a message apart from Jesus Christ. That solution has to be part of the good news. And that solution was promised from the beginning. We're going to actually look at this. What he's talking about, he goes back and shows us. He says, look, this didn't just happen. I was a scholar of the scriptures as a Pharisee, and I missed it. But now I understand it. It's interesting how God uses Paul's background. A Pharisee of Pharisees. And then he says, I'm going to take that and use that so that I can explain what I've been saying all along, even though, Paul, you missed it. We all miss it. We really only get it when God shows it to us. If we try to get it ourselves, we'll miss it. And we'll mess it up. And we'll lead others to mess it up. So let's not do that. The third thing he tells us is, the gospel is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. That problem that needs a solution, that requires the Son, has the power to save. The solution has power. Now, we can take that and go, yeah, I kind of get that in some distant, spiritual, not quite sure I understand way. That's not what Paul's saying. Paul's saying there is power in this message. There is spiritual power. And what that means for us is this. Don't have to use fancy words. Don't have to try to trick people. Paul says that later on. It didn't come to you in fancy talk or in some kind of physical appearance that would cause you to accept the words. I just spoke this power that was given to me. And it did the work. Important for us to remember. We really have nothing to add to this. We're more part of the problem than we are part of the solution, and God invites us into the solution, but we don't want to get away in the way of that solution. Amen? So let's not add anything to it. 3 things. This is the gospel message. He's ready to preach it to us. And we're going to spend the next 7 lessons going through Paul preaching to us in those 6 arguments. And the theme shows us that it's the same message from the beginning. This is confusing to us, by the way. Confusing to some, by the way. Well, Christianity and Judaism are different, and which message should I believe? And Paul is saying it's the same message. It's always been the same message. It's man who messes that up. Okay? And so we're going to see the consistency of that message from Adam forward. Given to Moses, from Adam forward, all the way through to Paul. He's going to say, it's the promise that God made the minute Adam was expelled from the garden. And all we're seeing is the fulfillment of that promise. And that fulfillment occurs in his Son. And that fulfillment has power in our lives. Not just to save us, but to save all. So we have quite a journey ahead of us. We get to listen as Paul preaches to us. We get to hear the message that propelled him throughout Asia Minor and into Europe. We get to watch the impact that it has as he shows us not just the differences between God's perfection and our imperfection, but what it means really in our lives. And then we get to share it with others. Are you guys excited about that?
Amen.
I am. Thank you. Let's take a 5-minute break.
And cut.